The eccentric stalker. It was January, the middle of winter. I had rented a small, isolated cabin by a frozen fishing lake, my perfect hideaway. The cabin was simple, just the essentials, a bed, a fireplace, and a small kitchen. It was enough for someone like me, who only wanted to fish and enjoy the quiet. I planned to stay for 3 days. The first day passed without incident. After settling in, I made myself a cup of hot coffee and relaxed by the fire. The next morning, I woke up at 7 a.m., eager to get to the lake and start fishing. It only took a 10-minute walk through the snow-covered path to reach the lake. The sky was overcast today. When I arrived, I set up my gear, drilled into the thick ice, and started fishing. Hours passed, and I was lost in the moment. But that day, as the wind picked up and the snow began to fall heavier, I decided to pack up and head back to the cabin. That's when I noticed the footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. At first glance, they seemed to be walking alongside me, following the path I had taken from the cabin. From my experience, I knew they were fresh. They stopped at the lake shore, where I had been fishing. And then, they turned back, following my trail toward the cabin. A sense of dread washed over me. Someone had been watching me, but I tried to reassure myself that it might just be another ice fisherman. I walked faster, trying to shake off the creeping fear. Back at the cabin, I bolted the door and threw another log into the fire, trying to warm up and forget about the footprints. I couldn't stop thinking about them, how they appeared so suddenly, how the footprints led straight to the cabin and then veered off into the woods. But as night fell, I heard something. My ears strained. There it was again, a sound unmistakably human footsteps approaching the cabin. I slowly moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back. Through the frost-covered glass, I saw a figure moving outside. They were wrapped in thick winter clothes, head to toe. They got closer, and through the dim light, I could make out an older man, large in size. Panic set in, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The figure on the snow kept moving toward me. I crouched below the window, hoping he wouldn't spot me. I peeked out, barely daring to look. My hand reached for the nearest object, a thick wooden stick, gripping it tightly in case things went wrong. He knocked lightly on the door. The door creaked open, inch by inch. I froze. Oh God, it wasn't locked. I must have forgotten to lock it. The door swung open, revealing the man, his face obscured by a woolen cap, his clothes tattered and worn. He stepped inside, leaving wet, snowy footprints across the wooden floor. Before he came further in, I needed a darker hiding spot. I pressed myself against the wall, behind a large shelf, in the darkest corner. I was trying not to make a sound. The man moved slowly, cautiously, as if taking his time to examine everything. On the table was the fish I had caught earlier that afternoon. He sat down, pulled out a knife from his coat, and began slicing into the raw fish. He ate it, greedily, and savored every bite. As I watched him devour the fish, it became clear he wasn't interested in me. In fact, he acted like I wasn't even there. After a while, he leaned back in the chair and lazily wiped his mouth with his hand. He sat there for a moment, then began glancing around the room. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't spot me. But then, satisfied with his meal, he stood up, moving sluggishly as if exhausted, and went straight to my bed. He lay down and was asleep within minutes. I moved quietly, tiptoeing as I carefully grabbed my bag and headed toward the door. Anything I could leave behind, I would. I knew this was my one and only chance. I reached the door and slowly opened it. I ran and didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, and I jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and as I sped away, the cabin shrank in the rearview mirror. fading into the darkness. The eccentric stalker. I never intended to return to that cursed cabin, but fate has a way of pulling you back to places you desperately want to forget. 6 months after that horrifying winter night, I had escaped the isolated cabin by the frozen lake. I thought I had escaped the terror, but the nightmares continued. The image of that man, silently eating the fish I caught and then lying down in my bed as if he owned the place, kept flashing in my mind from time to time. Eventually, the fear subsided, replaced by a desperate need for answers to the questions I had been asking myself. Who was he? Why was he there? And most importantly, what would have happened if I hadn't escaped? This time it was summer, with the snow melted and the lake no longer frozen. I decided to return to the cabin. I convinced myself that daylight would protect me, that the cabin would be less frightening. The journey to the cabin felt as strange as the first time, but now the scenery was lush and green, a stark contrast to the frozen wilderness I remembered. I didn't expect the trip to take so long, and it was already dusk when I arrived, but I had made it. I parked the car and cautiously walked slowly to the front door. The door creaked open, revealing the unchanged interior. A cold fireplace and the bed where that man had slept were still intact. I began searching the cabin, trying to find any sign of the man who had invaded my space months before. The silence here was suffocating, and memories of that haunting night started to flood back. Then I noticed a small leather-bound notebook on the nightstand, peeking out from under the pillow. It hadn't been there before. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The leather was worn and cracked, as if it had been used many times over a long period. I opened it to reveal yellowed pages filled with neat, small handwriting. It was a journal. The entries were dated, beginning several years ago, detailing the life of someone who had once lived here. The early entries spoke of peace and joy while fishing at the quiet lake, much like the way I had once enjoyed it. I could imagine such a beautiful scene, but then it changed. He started writing about sketching a scene of a stranger, a figure that would appear at the edge of the lake near a tree, watching him as he fished alone. This stranger, much like the one I had encountered, wore tattered clothes and seemed to survive on whatever he could find to eat. The final entry was dated the winter after I had rented the cabin. It was hastily written, the words barely legible. "He's inside. I can't leave. He won't let me go. I fear this will be the end." I put the journal down, my mind spinning. Was the man trapped by him? What had happened to him? And was he still alive? I realized I needed to leave, right now. As I turned to leave, the cabin door suddenly slammed shut. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing on the wooden floor. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself. I began to regret my curiosity. I backed into the corner, the same corner I had hidden in months before. The shadow gradually revealed itself. Who was it? The man from the journal or someone else? I couldn't be sure, but he seemed more sinister. I pressed myself against the wall, knowing I might have no escape. The man stepped closer. He was very near, and then his eyes met mine. I felt like my life was about to end here. I braced myself for the worst, but then he did something unexpected. He reached into his coat and pulled out the journal, handing it to me with a trembling hand. I stared at the book, then back at him. His eyes softened, pleading. It was as if he wanted me to take it. I reached out, my hand shaking, and took the journal from him. As soon as it touched my hand, it was like a hallucination. The man's form began to fade, disappearing, leaving only his eyes, glowing with sorrowful despair, before they too vanished. I didn't know what was happening anymore. I stumbled toward the door with the journal in my hand. As I stepped outside, I glanced back one last time. The cabin was silent, empty, but the feeling of being watched was gone. Then the unease returned. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove straight into town, straight to the police station, ready to tell them everything. A week later, the police informed me that the man in the journal was indeed the previous tenant, reported missing months ago. His body has yet to be found. The authorities boarded up the cabin, declaring it unfit for habitation. It was placed in a restricted area. I just hope that, unlike me, no one will return seeking answers, because you never know, it could be the last day you live. Vengeance of the Soul. It was Saturday night, and Hannah was still at her university library, finishing a project due next week. Her friend had ditched her again, leaving her to finish it all on her own. She checked the clock and saw it was nearly 10 p.m., so she closed her textbooks and returned them to the shelf. Hannah went back to the table and put her books in her bag, and at that moment, she heard a noise. She looked around and thought she saw a man staring at her, but when she blinked, he was gone. Hannah left and headed home. She knew she shouldn't wander alone in a new city. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned around, seeing a figure in a dark hoodie disappearing into an alleyway. She stopped, feeling a surge of fear. Was someone following her? She hurried on, relieved that her apartment was nearby. Hannah got into her building safely. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor. Just as the doors were closing, someone reached in to stop them. She held her breath as the doors opened, and a tall, fairly handsome man stepped into the elevator, his dark eyes looking at her with a warm expression. He started a friendly conversation, complimenting her outfit. She blushed, feeling a bit nervous. The elevator stopped on the 13th floor, and he stepped out, looking back at her and saying, "See you around." But as the doors started to close, Hannah saw him reach into his coat and pull out a shiny knife. Realizing the danger, she pulled out her phone as the elevator reached her floor. But just as she dialed the last digit for the police, the doors opened again. She screamed as she saw the man standing at the door, with nowhere left to run. He plunged the knife into her chest, her sweater soaking with blood. Pain spread across her chest as everything faded to black. The next morning, neighbors found Hannah dead in the elevator. Residents raised concerns about safety measures. Security cameras were installed, and more importantly, an emergency stop button was added to the elevator. Months passed, and the elevator killer remained uncaught. He prided himself on getting away with the perfect murder and wondered if he could pull it off again in the same building. He chose another Saturday night and saw a woman waiting to enter the elevator. He stood behind her, ensuring the guard was still distracted by his game on his phone. He pulled his hoodie tighter over his head as he noticed the camera. The doors opened, and the woman stepped inside. Just like before, she pressed 14, and he said he lived on the 13th floor as he pressed the button. But the woman didn't respond. She seemed strange, her head bowed, her hair covering most of her face. She wore a white dress and was barefoot, which he found odd, but her appearance didn't concern him. He kept a knife in his pocket, eager to use it. The 13th floor arrived, and he began to step out. He was ready to repeat what he'd done before, but as he turned back, he realized she was no longer in the elevator. Confusion crossed his face. He was certain she'd been there, but now the elevator was empty. He went in to check. The elevator door suddenly closed, and the overhead lights crunched and dimmed. He heard a hiss. The man felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as a chill ran down his spine. The guy looked up, and his eyes widened. The woman was crawling on the ceiling, her hair growing long and slithering like a snake. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her smiling mouth revealed many sharp teeth. He noticed a blood stain on her sweater and realized she was Hannah, the woman he had murdered. Hannah's spirit reached out, grabbing his neck, savoring his terror. Then Hannah pulled him into her bloody mouth, her razor-sharp teeth waiting for him. His screams echoed within the metallic confines of the elevator, but no one heard. The abandoned McDonald's. For the past few weeks, I had been planning a vlog to explore and uncover the rumors surrounding an abandoned McDonald's that had been circulating for years. Stories of massacres and unsolved crimes. Today, I finally made it here. As I drove towards it, my hands trembled with excitement, though the thought of experiencing it was pretty terrifying. But I believed that if this video went live, it would break all records on my channel. I arrived. It was truly an abandoned store, with peeling paint and dust-caked, grimy windows, giving it a very eerie feel. I took a deep breath and prepared to step through the door to explore. Inside, everything was eerily silent. The floor was dotted with patches of mold. The tables and chairs were arranged neatly, but covered with a thick layer of dust. I scanned my camera over the dining area, trying to capture every detail. The old menu was still there, faded and barely legible, just like the posters on the wall, all rotting from years of abandonment. I made my way towards the kitchen. Familiar machines like the ice cream maker and deep fryers were still there, but none of them were intact, all rusted beyond repair. Behind the counter, there was a large black mold patch on the floor. It sent shivers down my spine, as if someone had lain there for so long that their body had decomposed into the floor. I had heard rumors that the police once found a body here. I moved forward, trying to ignore the growing unease within me. I headed towards the restroom, just as my flashlight began to flicker. Suddenly, I felt something, a figure behind me. Startled, I turned around, only to see a Ronald McDonald statue grinning back at me. It didn't look anything like I remembered from my childhood. I forced a nervous laugh. I told myself it was just a statue, nothing to worry about. I continued, leaving the strange figure behind, heading towards the restroom. As I reached the restroom door, a musty smell hit my nose, but I pushed the door open anyway. I wanted to confirm a rumor that a killer had hidden a body here. I didn't know if it was true. I walked inside. There wasn't anything too unusual, just an old restroom, fairly spacious, covered in spots of stubborn moss. I felt a small sense of relief. I began panning the camera around every corner of the restroom. Maybe this place wasn't haunted like everyone said. In the end, rumors were just rumors. I left the room, but I couldn't shake off a strange feeling like I wasn't the only one here. My eyes darted to the floor, and I noticed dark stains that I hadn't seen before. I moved closer to capture them clearly on camera. Suddenly, I tripped, dropping the camera. As I bent down to pick it up, instinctively, I looked up and saw a horrifying sight right before my eyes. Hanging from the ceiling, there was a body suspended in the air, the red uniform with the unmistakable golden arches. It was a McDonald's employee. Her face was gaunt, her eye sockets empty and black, with long hair and arms swaying loosely from the ceiling. I needed to get out. My hands shook as I scrambled to grab my camera as quickly as possible. I had to leave, and fast. Now I believed the rumors were true. This place was haunted, cursed. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found a police station. I told them everything, handed over my camera, and waited for them to investigate. When the police searched the restaurant, they found nothing. But what about the footage on my camera? I reviewed all the footage of the restaurant, the kitchen, the restroom, everything was there. But when it got to the part with the Ronald McDonald statue, there was no statue at all. The terrifying scenes I had witnessed, none of it was in the video. I was left speechless, with no explanation. Strange disappearance. This happened about 2 years ago, when my sister Jan was studying at a university. She was shy, and not the kind of person who would stay out late or hang out with friends. One day, she went to school as usual. It was 5:00 p.m., and John hadn't come home yet. I thought she was probably studying since she was always so diligent. Around 6:30, I tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. I texted her, but there was no response. I told my parents, and they said not to worry, she wasn't a child anymore. But I had a strange feeling. Around 7 p.m. when I tried calling again, her phone was off. That was odd because Jan always answered my calls or, at the very least, texted me back. By 10 p.m., my parents had come home, and there was still no sign of Jan. Now even they were worried. We tried contacting her classmates, but they said she hadn't attended any classes that day. My parents and I went to the police to report her missing, but their search was in vain. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. 3 months passed with no sign of Jan. Our house, once warm, now felt cold and empty, haunted by her absence. Then, in December, it was a normal school day, the last day of my senior year. As I walked home, I couldn't believe my eyes. I saw her Jan standing at the corner of the street. I ran to her, calling her name, and she saw me. She started crying. I immediately brought her home, knowing my parents would be overjoyed to see her safe. When I walked in with her, my parents were shocked to see us. The house burst with emotion as my parents rushed to hug Jan. My mom cried, and my dad's face went pale with disbelief. But Jan's reaction was strange. She stood there, stiff, her arms hanging limply at her sides as if she didn't know how to respond. I thought she needed time to adjust after everything she had gone through. That night, I nervously brought her to her room. I had to ask what had happened to her during those 3 months. I tried to stay calm and not overwhelm her with questions. I asked her where she had been. She gave me a chilling smile and said she had been kidnapped. Then I asked how she escaped, and I was horrified by her answer. Jan told me it was easy. She had killed her captor, stabbing him until he stopped breathing. A shiver ran down my spine. The way she said it, without any emotion or compassion, this wasn't the Jan I knew. The days that followed were strange. Jan seemed more distant than before. One night, while Jan was still recovering from her trauma, I suddenly thought of a question that had never crossed my mind before. I hesitantly asked, "If you did that, where is the body of your kidnapper?" She turned to me and started smiling. She told me,
"On the outskirts of the city, there's a forest, and in that forest, there's a small cupboard. Inside that cupboard is his body."
I ran straight to my parents and told them everything. The next morning, we went to the police station, and they took us to the location Jan had described, just as she told me. The forest was dark and overgrown. We arrived, and there was a metal cupboard in the woods, just as Jan had said. The police opened it and found a rotting corpse, wearing the clothes and belongings of my sister, Jan. I couldn't believe my eyes. As I watched, the police took the body for forensic investigation, and it was confirmed the corpse was indeed my sister. As the truth came to light, fear overwhelmed my family. My parents, devastated, initially refused to believe it, but now everything was clear. That night, I snuck into Jan's room, trying to find any clue about who or what she really was. But when I opened the door, the room was empty. The bed was perfectly made, as if no one had touched it. She was gone, leaving nothing behind. It's been 2 years since that night, and I've always felt sadness and sorrow for my sister. That person, I've never seen her again. I will never know who impersonated my sister or why they did it. And it makes me wonder what would have happened if we had never discovered the truth. That thought is terrifying. The man passed through the door. It was a quiet evening. Abby was home alone as usual. Her mother often had to work 2 jobs in one day, from morning to late at night. so Abai had to take care of herself most of the time, and she was used to it. The house was peaceful. Her mother wouldn't be home for hours, so she took care of everything herself, from cooking to locking up, getting ready for bed. Before going to bed, Abi planned to relax a bit. She sat on the couch, ready to watch TV with a tub of ice cream in her hand. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. She froze, spoon of ice cream halfway to her mouth. It was strange her friends never visited this late, and her mom always used her key. Confused, she slowly walked to the door. She wasn't exactly scared, just curious. She opened the door and saw him, a man. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking on. He was bald, wore thick glasses, and had a scruffy beard with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't seem threatening, but something felt off. Abby greeted him, and the man smiled and asked, "Hello, little girl. Are your parents home?" At the time, she didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a friendly question. So Abby foolishly answered that her mom wasn't home. A smile spread across his face, but then she started to feel uneasy as his questions grew too interested. He smiled and said, "Good night. Don't get into any trouble," then walked away. Abby didn't understand what had just happened, so she closed the door. Her heart was racing, but she pushed it aside. He was just being friendly, she told herself. Abby returned to her ice cream. Her mind replayed the conversation. Something about the way he had looked at her and smiled made her feel uneasy. 10 minutes passed, and she began to feel comfortable again. The strange encounter faded from her mind. Then, there was another knock at the door. She thought it might be him again. This time, something told her to be cautious. She wasn't sure why, but before opening the door, she decided to lock the chain. When Abby opened the door, the chain caught, preventing it from opening fully. And there he was, the same man from earlier. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he pretended to be friendly again. He stammered a greeting to Abby again and said he just wanted to make sure she was okay. To her, he no longer seemed friendly. He looked desperate, as if realizing he hadn't gotten into the house and was trying to cover it up. Abby gave a quick thank you out of fear and slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she locked it. She stood there, frozen, staring at the door. Minutes passed, and she couldn't stop thinking about the man. But every sound, every creak of the house made her jump. She needed her mom and wished she were home. Suddenly, she heard the man's voice again, this time coming from the mail slot of the front door. He was whispering through the slot, saying he wanted to come in and had something to tell Abby. Abby froze in place. She screamed, "Leave me alone." The mail slot slammed shut, and then the pounding on the door started. He was banging hard, rattling the doorknob violently, shouting crude words demanding she open the door. She stumbled back, tears streaming down her face, silently praying he wouldn't get in. The banging grew louder, more frantic, as he tried to force the door open. For what felt like an eternity, Abby stood there, sobbing, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Perhaps the man had given up and left. She didn't move, only standing there, listening. About 30 minutes later, Abby's mom came home. The door opened, and she rushed in, finding her daughter in tears. Abby told her everything. Her mom immediately called the police about the incident, but they didn't find any trace of the man. As Abby lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about how lucky she was to have used the door chain. It was a small, almost insignificant decision, but it had saved her. Killer in the Rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and it called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside, they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet. But they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the Rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared. My hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. Nightmare House on the Hillside. I was 6 or 7 years old when my parents divorced. My younger sister had just been born. My mother and stepfather decided to move into a new house, thinking it would be a fresh start for all of us, but it didn't turn out that way. It was an old house in the suburbs, built in the mid-1800s. It had 2 stories and a basement below. Down there was a door that led to water tanks used to heat the house, locked tight, with only my mom and the landlord having the key. We were warned not to go near it. I didn't understand why, but my room was always colder than the other rooms, even though it was right above the basement. I often heard strange creaking sounds, like someone walking on the floorboards. The house was quite old, and I would often see wasps coming from the attic. They swarmed as if drawn to something. I wasn't the only one who experienced strange things. My mom and stepfather often heard footsteps in the living room late at night, pacing back and forth, never stopping. But they brushed it off and said it was nothing. One night, I woke up with a strange feeling, like someone was in the room with me. I turned over and saw a boy, his face obscured by shadows, wearing old-fashioned clothes, about my age, standing near my desk. I sat up in bed. He asked me if I wanted to play with his toys. I told him no, it was too late, and I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents. Then his expression changed, becoming angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from my cold room. I ran to tell my mom, but she reassured me it was just a dream. Still, I knew she didn't believe it either. I began to feel something was wrong with this house. The next night, it happened again. But this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She was standing on my bed. She stood hunched over, her tangled hair hanging down over my face. She stared at me with deep, hollow eyes that were completely black, her breath chilling as it hit my face. I jumped up, flung open the door, and ran to my sister's room. She was still asleep in her crib. I looked back at the door and saw the woman slowly walking toward me. As she passed the window, lightning struck outside, and in that moment, the woman disappeared. With each flash of lightning, she would reappear, getting closer to me. I woke up again, back in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what had happened. Was it a dream? But it felt too real. I ran to my mom and stepfather, telling them everything. Their faces went pale as I spoke, but they told me it was just a nightmare. It was a lie they had been telling me ever since we moved into that house. A few days later, we moved out. My mother didn't say why, but I could tell by the way she hurried us out of the house that something had scared her too. It wasn't until many years later that she told me. The landlord eventually confessed what had happened in the house long ago. During the Civil War, a widowed mother and her 3 children lived there. After her husband was killed in battle, the woman's mind shattered. You ever or roll? In a fit of madness, she killed the rest of her family in the living room before dragging their bodies down to the water tank room in the basement. These things explained what I had experienced in that house, from the moved items to my toys being displaced. The boy I saw was one of her children. still trapped in the house, either searching for companionship or perhaps seeking revenge. And the woman, the one who stood over my bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horrors she had endured. I often wonder what would have happened if we had stayed in that house. Would we have become part of their story? Would that woman have done to us what she had done to her own children? I will never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still think about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held. The Haunting of the Abandoned Station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. Man in Black Cloak. The sun shone down on a small village nestled among towering mountains. An old suspension bridge stretched across the rushing St. River, its wooden planks creaking in the wind. His name was Brandon, and he was sitting at the table, surrounded by stacks of books as he prepared for the bar exam. The stress weighed heavily on him, and he decided to take a break in a secluded spot. Stepping outside, the chilly late October air hit him. Brandon walked past a few nearby houses, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot creating a soothing sound. As he approached the suspension bridge, he gazed at the rushing river below. He closed his eyes, taking in the fresh air of nature. Suddenly, he felt the presence of someone nearby. He opened his eyes and saw a man in a black cloak standing in the middle of the bridge, fully shrouded. Brandon's heart raced as he saw the man drawing something on the railing of the bridge. A sense of unease rose within him, and he chose to avoid the man, turning back toward the forest along the riverbank. The overgrown trail ahead was thick with brush. He carefully tread over the uneven ground, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety after his encounter with the man. Emerging from the foliage, he reached the creek's edge. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. A brief sense of peace washed over him, but it was fleeting. In the fading light, Brandon saw flickering flames ahead. Confusion filled him, as he had expected to be alone out here. Curiosity rose despite his unease. Brandon moved closer, the crackling sound of the fire growing louder. As he approached, he saw 3 people in black cloaks standing around a man who looked injured, bound and covered in blood, lying on the ground. He could only hold his breath in fear. The flickering torchlight cast strange shadows, making the scene even more horrifying. They chanted ominously, in a language Brandon couldn't understand. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the terrifying sight. Panic rose within him, and he knew he needed to leave. One of the cloaked figures pulled out a knife, and Brandon's instincts screamed that something was wrong. He couldn't stay here any longer. He had to run. Just as he was about to flee, the man Brandon had seen on the bridge appeared, stepping out of a small boat nearby, his hood falling back to reveal tattoos covering his pale skin. At that moment, the man pointed in Brandon's direction, and in an instant, it was clear he had seen him. The world around him seemed to fade into darkness, and the man's demonic eyes appeared to pierce through his soul. The discomfort Brandon had felt earlier on the bridge turned into pure terror as the man began to move toward him quickly and menacingly. Brandon's instincts kicked in immediately. He forgot about the poor man being held as a sacrifice and started running. He could hear the man's breath behind him as he ran through the brush, branches whipping against his face. The twigs scratched at his arms as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Brandon was losing strength, and the distance to safety seemed endless. He finally emerged from the forest and onto the trail. The man and his cloak were still behind him, so he turned left toward the bridge. As there were no houses nearby and no one to call for help, the weight of exhaustion hit him, but there was no time to rest. He turned around and saw the man approaching, his face like a mask of rage. When he reached the middle of the suspension bridge, he stood there in disbelief and filled with fear. He looked at the wooden railing and read the mark that the cloaked man had written less than half an hour ago. It was barely legible, as it had been etched with a blade, but he was certain it read, Brandon McCain, August 7th, 1993, to October 20th, 2021. It was his name, along with his birth date. He realized that perhaps today would be a milestone in his life. And when he noticed the man approaching, holding a dagger, that could be the day he was about to die. The man swung the blade at him, and Brandon only had a few minutes to act. Brandon forgot all the legends, the depth, and the freezing temperatures, the river that could be a monster pulling him under. He didn't care. He lifted his right leg onto the railing, and as the man moved, Brandon dodged the blade that nearly pierced him. As the icy water splashed around him, his blood circulation became erratic. He only had enough time to look up and see the man on the bridge, still watching. But the freezing water dragged him down, and his body began to tremble as unbearable pain engulfed him. Brandon was nearly lost to disorientation, sinking slowly before closing his eyes, perhaps never to open them again. Strange man in the cemetery. This summer, my family decided to go camping in a suburban village, a place where every corner seemed to hold a mysterious story. The locals were always whispering, especially about the nearby forest. But what intrigued me the most was the cemetery within the forest. No one had ever gone there after dark. We were not allowed to go there either. My cousin had the idea to play hide and seek at night. He liked to break boundaries, challenging all of us to venture into the forbidden forest. I went with my younger sister, who was only 10 at the time, and my cousin. He confidently decided to help us hide. I should have known it was a bad idea the moment he mentioned the cemetery. We crept through the forest, the leaves crunching underfoot. The closer we got to the cemetery, the colder the air became. Even the stray dogs that had been barking earlier were now completely silent. A sense of fear and unease flooded over me. My little sister held my hand tightly. But then, in the eerie silence, a sound pierced the air, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the unmistakable sound of digging. Out of the darkness, we saw him, a disheveled old man in filthy clothes, hunched over a grave. He was digging with his bare hands, muttering something incomprehensible. My eyes followed his hand. I saw something pale, like a stiff hand, sticking out of the freshly dug earth. None of us dared to move for a moment. My cousin was the first to act. He slowly pulled us back, whispering that we had to leave, that we needed to move silently. The man bent down again, this time pulling away more earth, revealing more of an arm, a foot, a body. Then he dragged out several small plastic bags and laid them on the ground. My sister trembled. and we were slowly sneaking away. Then I accidentally stepped on a branch. My heart skipped a beat, knowing that sound might give us away. He slowly raised his head, turned to us, and said,
"You shouldn't be here."
Then he stared at us and gave a slow, creepy smile as if he had lost his mind. The man laughed maniacally, wiping his dirty hands on his pants. Then he took a step forward, his bare feet dragging across the ground.
"You kids want to know what's down here?"
Before I could react, my cousin scooped up my sister, pulling her into his arms. The man's voice taunted us, as if daring us.
"See what they're hiding in the ground."
I stumbled, frozen. My cousin yanked on my arm, snapping me back to reality. He yelled, "Run!" and we bolted away from the cemetery. I ran as if my life depended on it. I could hear him behind us, his feet scraping on the gravel, his wheezing breath growing closer. I didn't dare stop. My cousin pulled us forward, his grip tight, until we reached the cemetery gate. We burst through the gate. For some reason, the man had stopped. He was no longer chasing us. He didn't follow, just stood there, watching. Then, as if he had never been there, he turned around and disappeared into the darkness of the cemetery. We returned to the campsite. No one said a word or mentioned what had happened. The next day, we found out that the old man had been arrested by the police. He was a deranged criminal who had been desecrating graves to smuggle drugs across the border. That night, we felt truly lucky. I still wonder what would have happened if he had been younger, stronger, faster. We never went near that forest again and reminded ourselves never to ignore warnings and restrictions again. Stranger on the way home. I was driving home on a quiet, deserted road, my headlights cutting through the thick darkness. A familiar road I had traveled countless times. I was still about 10 minutes away from home when my car began to slow down. Confused, I pressed the gas pedal, but the car continued to lose speed. Panic set in as I realized the problem I had run out of gas. I suddenly remembered the low fuel warning light had come on, but I had forgotten about it, and in my rush, I had completely missed stopping to refuel. My car stalled, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out of the car, the chilly night air biting at my skin. Glancing at my phone, I saw the worst: no signal. I wasn't surprised. This road had no reception. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. It was nearly midnight, and there was no point in calling anyone. My friends were likely already asleep. I knew the area well enough to remember a gas station about a mile away. It would take 20 minutes to walk, maybe less, and the weather was fairly mild. So I decided I would make the quick trip. I grabbed an empty gas can I kept in the back of my car for my lawnmower. At least luck was on my side in some small way. There were no streetlights, only dense forests on either side. The road was eerily quiet. Only one or two cars passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the empty road before vanishing into the night. As I walked, my footsteps crunched on the gravel by the roadside. Every sound seemed amplified by the stillness. I felt a bit uneasy, but I kept walking. Then, I heard it. It was the sound of a car engine behind me. I stopped and turned around. A pickup truck was slowly approaching the spot where my car had broken down. My first thought was that they might stop to help, and for a brief moment, I considered asking for a ride. But then I saw them, two men. They got out of the truck, their faces quickly obscured by black masks pulled over their heads. One of them shined a phone flashlight into the window, while the other knocked on the door. They tried to open it, but of course, the doors were locked. I crouched down and moved closer to the edge of the forest, hiding in the shadows. Maybe they hadn't seen me yet, but they were rummaging through my car. Panic rose in me when one of them turned and looked in my direction. Suddenly, He started walking toward me. I froze. The other man got back in the truck, and I heard the engine roar as it sped forward, heading straight for me. I didn't have time to think. I sprinted into the forest. Behind me, I could hear the man crashing through the undergrowth, chasing me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch me. In what felt like an eternity, I ran through the edge of the forest, dodging trees and leaping over fallen logs. After a few minutes, I saw a large, isolated house ahead of me. I ran behind the house, pressing myself against the rough, cold brick wall. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my ears straining to hear any sound of pursuit. I crouched there for a few minutes. Finally, I dared to move, cautiously slipping through the backyard toward the old path. I didn't want to knock on the door because it was too late, and I didn't want to cause them any alarm. I walked on high alert, every sound making me shiver. I looked around the area. No truck, no sign of the men. I continued walking toward the gas station. Another car came, and without thinking, I rushed back into the forest, hiding until the sound of the engine faded away. Finally, the gas station appeared in front of me. I felt relief as I filled up the gas canister. When I finally made it back to my car, I shakily poured the gas into the tank. I drove straight home, too scared to look back. As I sat in the safety of my own home, I couldn't shake the thought of those men, and I realized how lucky I was to have made it home safely. Abandoned house invaded. Behind my house, there is a large but old and decaying building. It no longer resembles a home. It now looks more like an abandoned house. It has been vacant for decades, or so my parents said. But every time I passed by, I would unmistakably hear the sound of electricity crackling from inside. It made no sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, one day I decided to investigate. I asked my friend Tim to come with me after school. He agreed, though we both felt a tense, underlying dread as we stood in front of the house, a bad premonition hanging in the air. As soon as we pushed the door open, it creaked on its rusty hinges, filling the silence. Inside, the air was thick with an unbearable stench, a mix of mold and rot. Scattered across the floor were piles of old dog food, and the foul odor hit us in waves. We carefully stepped through the strange debris and noticed something odd. The floor was littered with nails, hundreds of them, along with animal traps, as if someone had deliberately tried to prevent people from walking through the house. We tiptoed through, avoiding the nails, our curiosity growing stronger with each step. Then we heard the sound of an electric charge, followed by a scream of pain from upstairs. It sent a shiver down my spine. We should have turned back, but our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to climb the stairs. On the second floor, the noise led us to a closed door. From behind it, we heard a man's voice muttering something strange, as if giving commands. What was happening on the other side? Summoning our last bit of courage, we tiptoed up the stairs and peeked inside. The sight was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. It looked like someone had been chained up. Two people sat on the floor, appearing to be a couple who had been captured and imprisoned. Their eyes were wide open, filled with terror. A man stood before them, holding a stun gun, threatening them to follow his commands. For a moment, the room fell silent as the two people stared at us in disbelief. Their eyes pleaded for help, silently begging for mercy. Then their voices broke with desperation, sobbing and pleading not to be harmed. The man panicked, shouting at them to be quiet while violently beating them with the stun gun. But they continued screaming, their cries echoing through every corner of the room. Tim froze, paralyzed with fear, and accidentally knocked over a piece of wood, creating a loud noise. That was when the man noticed us. The man turned toward us, his eyes filled with rage. Without hesitation, he grabbed the stun gun and charged at us. We bolted down the stairs, but Tim wasn't fast enough. His screams echoed down the hallway as I heard the crackling of the stun gun. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I called the police, barely able to get the words out, but I knew I couldn't leave Tim behind. I ran back into the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible, recalling the self-defense lessons I had learned at school. The door to the room was still open, and I peeked in. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was putting a collar around Tim's neck, his hands already bound tightly. I couldn't just stand there and watch my friend and these innocent people suffer like this. Rage surged through me, and I charged at the man, kicking him with all the strength I had. He staggered and fell, dropping the stun gun. I grabbed it, threatening him. Moments later, the police arrived and pulled me away from him. As the police began to untie the captives, they discovered something even more horrifying. Their feet had been glued to the floor with industrial adhesive. I was horrified that the man had gone to such lengths. Finally, the rescue team arrived, and the hostages were freed, though their condition was dire. They had been beaten, starved, and fed animal food. When the police interrogated the man, his chilling response was that he wanted to keep humans as pets. In the end, he was arrested and taken to prison. None of us ever spoke about that day again. This is a warning from what I witnessed. If you ever come across an abandoned house, no matter how strong your urge to explore, resist it. Stay away, because no one can guarantee you will make it out alive.
Scary story in the hospital. Nana. She is a nurse with experience working with elderly patients at a geriatric hospital. Today is her extra shift, so she is severely sleep deprived. She was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward love her very much. Tonight, Nana is attending to some patients, but one of them makes her more uneasy than the others. Her name is Len. Not only that, this is a poorly lit hospital room. The air is thick with the smell of antiseptic, mixed with a faint musty odor that sometimes gives her goosebumps and makes her shiver. This is her first night working with Mrs. Len. Len is a middle-aged woman with messy hair and wide, fearful eyes. Every time she enters the room, Len starts talking about the voices she hears and the man in black in the corner of the room. Another woman in the room had requested the curtain to be drawn before her shift started so Len wouldn't be disturbed. The shift starts around 9 p.m., and most patients are asleep by 11 p.m., but not Len. Whenever she calls her in, she speaks with a trembling voice about the voices she hears. The man in black keeps staring from the corner of the room, which frightens her a bit. She has to reassure herself that it's just the medication. She believes that in Len's mind, she is seeing and hearing these things and feels very empathetic. Just imagining those things is very scary. She tries her best to help Len calm down and sleep. Len calmed down and fell asleep after a while. When most of the patients have fallen asleep, time seems to pass very slowly. The corner of the room appears darker, the shadows thicker. and now it has become suffocatingly silent. 1 or 2 hours later, while Nana was in the equipment room to get some supplies, I heard something in the room. The room was quite small and relatively quiet. Strangely, she had closed the door. She immediately turned around but saw nothing and continued to focus on getting the supplies. She tried to focus, but Len's silent warnings echoed in her mind, creating a sense of unease. A moment later, she suddenly felt a cold chill down her neck, as if a hand touched both of her shoulders. Nana looked down at her shoulders and then screamed loudly, but there was nothing there. She looked around and checked the door. There was no one in the room, but she felt a large presence gripping her shoulders. With no other choice, she had to complete her work. She continued loading items onto the cart until it was full. When the supplies were full, the single light bulb above her flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Nana glanced at a moving shadow reflected on the wall in front of her. She turned around and saw a faint human silhouette reflected in the glass window of the storage room door. The figure was not clear, but its presence was unmistakable. It stood completely still, watching her. Her breath caught, and her hands began to tremble. As she slowly approached, she started screaming loudly and collapsed to the floor, her heart pounding as she saw the man in black standing there, smiling eerily through the glass. The scream was loud enough to wake everyone up. The man disappeared from view through the glass door, and a few seconds later, the door opened, and one of her colleagues helped her up. She immediately asked about the man, but there was no one else there besides the two of them. The scream had awakened Mrs. Len, and when she walked in, Mrs. Len was holding her head, repeatedly talking about the voices, the laughter, and the screaming. Nana asked her what the man in black looked like, if he was smiling strangely. But Mrs. Len just focused, frowned, and looked at the corner of the room, terrified. She then said,
"How do you know?"
And Nana began to feel scared, her heart racing, thinking it might be true. Mrs. Len started screaming to be taken out of there and urged to be removed quickly before he arrived. The other nurses came in and tried to help her calm down. That night, due to unstable mental health and overwhelming fear, every creak and groan of the old building startled her. Her nerves were tense and painful, but she vowed to protect her patients from any darkness lurking in the shadows. Determined to find the source of this evil presence, Nana, with a sense of medical duty, returned once more, summoning all her courage as she descended the creaking basement stairs, the air growing colder with each step. She found herself in a forgotten basement room filled with dusty old medical equipment and shelves lined with ancient books. In the center stood an old mirror covered in a thick layer of grime. Nana approached the mirror, feeling a powerful, oppressive energy emanating from it. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the reflection, clearer and more terrifying than ever. Realizing the figure was bound to the mirror, Nana frantically searched the room and found a ritual doll on one of the shelves. An inscription indicated it could be used to banish the spirit. Gathering all her courage, Nana placed the doll down and recited a prayer she had learned as a child, hoping to expel the evil presence. The shadows wavered, and the figure seemed to weaken. But it wasn't enough. The figure screamed in rage as she pressed the cross and the doll against the mirror. The glass shattered with a piercing sound, and the figure disintegrated. The room began to warm, the oppressive feeling dissipating. Everything gradually felt lighter. Everything was strangely quiet and peaceful. A few days later, Len improved and was discharged from the hospital. Nana continued her work with a new purpose, always vigilant for potential encounters with the otherworldly. This was also a testament to the power of courage and the triumph of light over darkness.
The Clown in the Tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it. His hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down. But recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looks sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave. I don't know how." I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play.